We are at the very end of the reading of our Torah. Next week, we're going to celebrate Simchat Torah, and we're going to conclude the reading of the book of Deuteronomy. And then, as is our custom, we immediately begin again with Genesis. And over the centuries, the rabbis have tried to connect the end of the Torah with the beginning to try to teach us something new and perhaps unexpected by juxtaposing these two sections. It's not clear that that's how it was originally meant to be read, that you would conclude Deuteronomy and then go right back to Genesis, but that has become our custom. And so the rabbis wanted to find meaning in that juxtaposition, in that custom. And I want to share with you this evening one attempt to do that in the name of my cousin, Rabbi Eliezer Davidovich. Many of you have heard me teach in his name before. He was born in Eastern Europe in 1878, and he died at the hands of the Nazis in 1942. And I always find it very meaningful to share words of his Torah. And here's a little bit of his attempt to connect the last parasha, V'zot HaBracha, with the first one, Bereshit, which we'll read next Shabbat. So the very last verses of the Torah, chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, go like this. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Eternal singled out face to face for the various signs and portents that the Eternal sent him to display in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his courtiers and his whole country, and for all the great might and awesome power that Moses displayed in the sight of all Israel. The very last word of the Torah is Yisrael. Now, the important thing to note in order to understand my cousin's teaching are a few words from the very last line in the book of Deuteronomy, describing our teacher Moses. It says in that verse that Moses demonstrated great might and awesome power, which might seem to just be sort of a redundancy or an underlining, which is the way the Torah kind of bolds something, is it seems to repeat it. Great might, awesome power. They almost seem like synonymous phrases, but that's not how my cousin's going to interpret it. Earlier in the Torah, we read about how Moses was very humble. It says he was ish tsanua me'od. He was very, very humble, more so than any other person on earth. And here, according to my cousin, is Moses' awesome power. Moses understood that sometimes, even though he was such a humble person, he understood that sometimes he had to act forcefully and he had to show some chutzpah. He had to stand up tall and proud and make demands by speaking truth to power, as he does with Pharaoh when he says bravely and boldly, Shlach et ami, let my people go. And this is Moses' awesome power, is he knew how, in just the right measure, to combine humility with pride. And this brings us to the beginning of the Torah. How does the Torah begin? It starts, that first verse, Bereshit, bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Just as Moses knew how to combine humility with chutzpah, and here are the words of my cousin Eliezer Davidovich, similarly, during the creation of the world, God created the sublime, that is, the heavens, shamayim, and on the same day, according to our story of creation, God created haaretz, the earth, a symbol of humility, because we read that the earth is made of dust. This is the secret that contains the connection between the conclusion of the Torah and its beginning. The last lines of Deuteronomy and the first line of Genesis are a lesson read this way about combining humility and pride perfectly in order to get things done in the most elevated and refined manner. And my cousin notes that this principle is taught in other places in rabbinic tradition, notably in the Talmud, in Tractate Sotah, and there's a story told there in the name of Rabbi Chia Bar Ashi, and he teaches this in the name of his teacher, Rav. And he says, despite the the fact that we are told that we should not have excessive pride, ga'ava in Hebrew. He says a Torah scholar should have 1/8. Now, the math is important for what's going to happen later. You didn't know you were going to get math tonight, but there's a little bit of math. He says you should have 1/8 of 1/8 portion of pride. Rav Huna, son of Rav Yehoshua, said, and this minute measure of pride crowns him. This is like, it's like a crown that he wears on his head, this type of pride. And Rava said that a Torah scholar who has excessive pride should be excommunicated. He should not be allowed to be a teacher of Israel. But at the same time, a Torah scholar who has no pride at all should be excommunicated as well. Now, this is an example of rabbinic hyperbole. I don't think he actually meant that the person should be excommunicated, but it was his way of saying that excessive pride is to be avoided, arrogance, but also excessive humility is to be avoided as well. You need to have a certain measure of pride. We need a little pride, chutzpah, if we are going to believe that what we have to share in this world is something that is worthy of sharing, something that's meaningful. But how much pride should we have? How much of this holy chutzpah, according to our tradition, 1/64th a measure. Just 1/64th of you should have pride. And then my cousin playfully concludes his teaching with a little gematria, which is a form of Jewish numerology. And I don't think the rabbis take gematria seriously. I think it's a play for them. They're having fun with it. And you might notice, and you might have, this might be a custom of yours or of members of your family, you might notice that some Jews, particularly Orthodox Jews, when they write a letter or if they publish an essay, at the top of the page, there will be a little abbreviation, Bet Samech Daled, Bet Samech Daled. And that stands for an Aramaic expression that means with God's help, with God's help. But my cousin plays with those letters because in Hebrew, every letter corresponds to a number. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3. So Samech, the letter Samech, is 60. And I'm going to let you guess what the letter Dalet is. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, 64. So he says whenever you put that on a piece of paper, something that you're writing, you're referencing this 1/64th part of you that should be prideful, that should have that sort of chutzpah. And davka, why in particular do you put that on something that you're writing? Because the act of writing is in some ways an act of chutzpah. From a Jewish perspective, that which was written all those years ago, according to our tradition, by God, that's all you would ever need. What do I need to add to it? I'm going to write a little commentary and that's going to add to perfection. Again, this is from the traditional Jewish view of Torah. So whenever you write something, you put that saying, okay, I'm not going to be too prideful, but I'm also going to acknowledge that it takes a little bit of pride, a little bit of chutzpah to put something down on paper. So the lesson of connecting the end of the Torah with the beginning is really a lesson about humility. It reminds us we're not Moses, we're not Miriam, but on the other hand, we're not nothing. We, just like they, were created in God's own image. And so we should write down our thoughts and we should share them with humility with others. We should paint, we should compose, we should do all of the creative things that we are inspired to do, but with a certain measure of humility along the way. Now, almost 30 years ago, during Sukkot, I was living in Jerusalem, and I traveled from Jerusalem to Ramat HaSharon to visit my cousin, Menashe Davidovich, who was the grandson of Rabbi Eliezer Davidovich, the one I was just talking about. And he invited me to have dinner with him and his wife and his family in their sukkah. And after dinner, he presented me with a book that he had just published. And most of the words in that book are actually those of his grandfather, Eliezer Davidovich. And here's the act of holy chutzpah that enabled them, those words, to find their way eventually to me, and now some of them to you. On the eve of his deportation, and what would soon after be his death at the hands of the Nazis in a mass grave outside of Lublin, Eliezer Davidovich took the manuscript that he had spent his life writing, including all of his interpretations of Torah that he had recorded over the years, and he hid the manuscript in the attic of the family home. And after the war, his grandson, Menashe, my cousin, who had survived Auschwitz and Dachau, returned to the family home, hoping to find members of the family. Unfortunately, only a few survived. But a non-Jewish family friend told him about the manuscript and that his grandfather had hidden it away. And he recovered it, and he brought it with him a few years later to the land of Israel when he made Aliyah in 1949. And then 50 years later, on the 50th anniversary of his grandfather's murder in 1992, Menashe published the manuscript just in time to give me a copy that night when I was visiting him in his sukkah. And then a few years later, I had the holy chutzpah to imagine that I could translate this book into English so I could share some of his writings with others. There is magic and there is wonder in connecting endings with beginnings. And here we are beginning again, a new year, a fresh start. This past year has taught us all a lot about humility. We realize how little power we actually have. We realize how much we are not in control of very much of anything. And yet, without some pride, 1/64th maybe, without a little holy chutzpah, how could we hope to have navigated this challenging time? To imagine that somehow we might be able to make it through to the other side. Imagine that sense of holy chutzpah in the hands of all of those scientists who worked tirelessly to find a way for us to ever so slowly return to life as we want it to be. In the beginning, God created it all. Our tradition teaches us the mundane and the sublime, heaven and earth as well. At the dawn of a new year, we go forth with humility and a little chutzpah too. Shabbat Shalom.